Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Blue Maxima. So, I said in my video on Millennium Soldier Expendable, which nobody bloody watches, that the site that I was writing for, Exclusively Games, has decided that it's not going to do any more articles. So I figured now would be the best time to start adapting those articles to some sort of video, whether it be a rant like this one, or a more properly produced video. With that said, the first article I ever wrote for the site, and it's actually the article I believe that got me a writing gig there, more or less, because it was something I always wanted to write. I was planning to turn it into a video script for like months, but you know me, don't bandwagon, and Apex Legends came out. This was actually written before Apex Legends was even announced, but considering how Apex Legends went, in both my personal opinion of the game and of how popular it actually got, it has convinced me that Titanfall is basically dead as a concept. And hearing that a Titanfall game that was originally planned for like this year or last year or whatever has officially not happened, it's been cancelled, well, I don't feel guilty anymore, because if I'm being perfectly honest, I don't think Titanfall 3 was ever going to happen anyway. Not in a way that I would have personally appreciated, because, well, Titanfall 2 was the biggest disappointment for me in games in years. Literal years. We're talking, like, it was the worst game I played that year based on the sheer quality of its predecessor alone. And I understand how thoroughly I'm going against the grain on this one, but let me just... I played so much of Titanfall and Titanfall 2. Titanfall was amazing. Titanfall 2, I was trying to find any scrap of general redemption from it, right? On Titanfall 2, I got up to Prestige 2, which is basically a max level and then you max level again. And on Titanfall 1, I got up to Prestige 4 twice, because my original Origin account got hacked by Russians. I'm not even kidding on this. This is legitimately what happened. I signed into my account one day and some guy started talking to me in Russian, and my Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4 games wouldn't connect to 90% of the servers anymore because they were banned by anti-cheat. So, yes, I have Prestige 4'd in Titanfall 1 twice, because I just love that game that much. It is one of the best FPSs I have had the pleasure of playing, not only in this generation, but in the previous generation. It was just that good. So, the only reason I stopped playing Titanfall 1 was because the Australian population was so low, I was facing the same 6 guys for weeks on end. I would recognize their names and send them, like, messages on chat saying sup, and they'd send back sup back. And it was so disappointing when they moved over to Titanfall 2 and that game died as well. But anyway, Titanfall 2 was announced, and despite the slight rough edges of the original, there were a few things that game could have done better, but honestly, there's nothing that game in particular did wrong. Outright wrong. I'm not talking like that game had massive screw-ups, but there were little things that they could have changed in order to really up the ante. So when Titanfall 2 was announced, I was massively excited, because of course I was. I pre-ordered it. I played the multiplayer beta. And I was let down in so many ways. To be fair, I got a bit of early warning when I played the beta for Titanfall 2, but we'll get to that, trust me. So, as I said before, I do have 2 generations in Titanfall, which is what they call prestiging. So I've got plenty of time in it. I played it a lot back in the day. I was there to see how they tried to save it within the first couple of months, but they just really failed. A lot of people keep saying something along the lines of, Titanfall 2 was so awesome, why the hell does it not have more players? And I keep thinking to myself, I said the same thing about Titanfall 1, but you bastards didn't think that one was very good, so what the hell are you complaining about? You got an outright worse game that you're praising more than that anyway. I did actually try to play a bit of multiplayer when I was trying to record this footage. This is entirely campaign, by the way. But for whatever reason, the multiplayer, for whatever reason I say, the multiplayer on PC is absolutely dead. Like, there was like 20 people online when I went and had a look, in comparison to how there was usually something like 2,000 back in the day. And finding a match was going to be outright impossible, even with like all of the mixtape settings on and all that. So, With that said, I'm going to talk to you about how Titanfall 2 failed in every sense of the word, right? I do have some positives for Titanfall 2, and I will bring them up as we go along, but the amount of negatives, especially in comparison to Titanfall 1, are just so ridiculous that this article was like 2,600 words. 2,600. And I could have gone further. I legitimately could have nitpicked for days, and I probably could have got that to like double that word count, but no. These are just the major things that stand out immediately. With that said though, let's start with what would get most people to stop watching this video immediately, and that's criticizing the campaign, because, well, the campaign is not very good, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. There are some notable things about it. I will say that the part where you are running around on the assembly line for assembling the prefab houses was pretty cool, which is like what half this footage is. And the time travel mission was also pretty cool, but it's also indicative of what one of the biggest problems with Titanfall 2 is, and that it was basically just a linear puzzle. That's all it was. Like, all you needed to do was hit the Q button at the right times, and you wouldn't even have to go into combat. You could just get out of the way of most of the enemies in general. And that is actually, as I said before, a bit of a problem with Titanfall, Titanfall 2's gameplay campaign in general, right? But we'll start with one of the less obvious things, and that's the story. So, Titanfall 1, while its campaign's story was told in a bit of a weird way, just in the background of ongoing matches, I really liked this outlook, because it's a lot like a radio play. I remember having some really fond memories of playing Earth Defense Force before I played Titanfall, right? And their way of telling story was, it would give you these radio broadcasts that would tell you what was going on in the background. Titanfall 1 was a bit more in-depth than that. It had main characters talking about things that were going on while you were fighting to get whatever was done. And they actually had, like, different endings for each of the battles, too. So if someone won or someone lost, different things would happen in the campaign. It was obviously set to go down in a very specific way, but still, it gave you a little bit of view into the way the universe worked, the politics worked, what exactly something was usable for. Someone coming into Titanfall 2 isn't going to know why the hell a Spectre factory would be so useful until they actually go up against the Spectres and they have to extrapolate. Meanwhile, in Titanfall 1, you're fighting for the Spectre factory. It just makes it feel a lot more bigger. The conflict feels a bit bigger. It feels like there's actual consequences. And the biggest consequence... So, here's the thing, right? Like, Titanfall 1's campaign didn't have a massive amount of set pieces, right? It had a couple, and that's what made them more impactful. Like, I absolutely loved how, I believe it was Demeter, but I could be wrong on that. I literally haven't played Titanfall 1 in years, and I really wish there was still a population for it. I have an Xbox One, but it's not mine, so I can't get Titanfall for it and expect to play it just, like, actively. But on Demeter, I believe if it's the militia wins, the planet explodes underneath them. That is an absolutely amazing set piece. I love that set piece to death, and I'm so disappointed there wasn't anything like that in this game. But yeah, so the problem with the story with Titanfall 2 is that instead of being over a completely distinct set of planets where you could do a bunch of really interesting things, it was all shoehorned into one planet, and this one planet was so much more dull than any individual planet in Titanfall 1 in both location design and just general story beats. Outside of the one or two set pieces that I've already brought up, which is the prefab house section and the time travel section, the rest is just completely unmemorable. It's like hallways, it's like weird landscapes. There's this one thing, just like this one set of structures, which is just a over the top of a set of structures is over the top of like poison fog, which looks kind of cool, but when you're actually on there, it just looks like the same bunch of metal hallways that you've been fighting in for ages. And yeah, it's most of it is entirely unmemorable. And there was a bunch of stuff. It's like, oh yeah, I remember this from the first time I played Titanfall 2, but I forgot it because it was entirely like unrecognized or unmemorable otherwise. Most of the characters from the first game don't show up in the second game either, and when they do, they feel so shoehorned in that it's kind of ridiculous. It feels like the game was meant to be more of a mercenary versus mercenary story at the beginning, but they just slapped the IMF and the militia factions down on top of it. Now, I'm not going to be one to say that the IMF wasn't truly evil or the militia wasn't truly good, but at least it was a little bit more grey area in Titanfall 1. In Titanfall 2, it feels like they've gone so far with badgering the IMC with the space Nazis sort of ideology, mindset, what have you, that it just doesn't feel like it has any sort of, grey area, and therefore the story isn't anywhere near as interesting. And it just turns into kill all the bad guy mercenaries before they kill you, which, like, don't get me wrong, it's not a bad idea for a story, but it could have been executed that much better. And compared to the end of Titanfall 1, where an entire planet blows up under you, and you feel like, well, I say you feel like, but it seems like you've made an absolute contribution to the war. Something is happening underneath your feet, even if you don't understand it the best, compared to Titanfall 2, where it's just like, okay, they had a cool artifact, now they lost it, and maybe they lost a planet under it. But nothing's really changed for the outlook of the war. And, again, Titanfall 1 wasn't the best of this, but it was still better than this. With that said, campaign level design. So, the fact that Titanfall actually put together its campaign and its multiplayer was actually a really unique idea, and considering that all they really had to work on was, like, the multiplayer maps and then build a story around them, they had a ton of time to play around with the maps, how they work, and how they flow. All of them are huge. They are absolutely massive. They're all fun to play in. And I can still remember a bunch of the maps from Titanfall 1 to this day, despite not having played it in years. Like Angel City, or the one where there's just a big giant amount of buildings in the middle and then a big circle around the outside for you to go and wander around in Titans. There was that one that took place in the resort. There was that one on the DLC pack that took place with all the gigantic trees that you could all run around. There was the one that took place in that desert with the gigantic pterodactyl-style birds flying around all the time. There was all of those interesting map designs. They were massive. They all had alternate paths. They all didn't comply to any sort of like design. They all felt so different that it was absolutely great because all the maps were so varied that it gave the game a lot of longevity map variety wise. And you have plenty of options for working on foot in a Titan or both, because you've got a bunch of little paths that will connect from anywhere to anywhere. It's not like Call of Duty where all the maps are based around, old Call of Duties. Modern Warfare did take a few steps in this regard. But back when Titanfall came out, Call of Duty was stuck with its 3-lane map design, which made it so boring. And not to mention the just general, as I said, the general size of them was big, but the scale of them was big as well, right? When you were on foot, running around, watching the enemy AI grunts take up positions, hacking specters, hacking turrets, and trying to find good vantage points to see where the enemy was going to come from so that you could beat the absolute bejesus out of them. It meant that it had a sense of scale that made it feel like a war. That was the thing that I absolutely loved about Titanfall. It made you feel like you were in the middle of a war and you were just one tiny part of it. That sort of feeling of being a cog in the machine is very rare in games like this, because you always feel like you're multiple cogs at once, and if you weren't there, the entire thing would fall apart without you for no real reason. It would just be like, hey, we just lost like 1/6 of our workforce, we're just going to die now. It's kind of like Battlefield 4, where, you know, you're one tiny little cog in the machine, right? Or a game like Arma, where there's an obvious chain of command. This game's a lot more abstract about it in the sense that, you know, everything's running around and you can't really control it or anything like that, but just, do you get what I mean? Scale. It feels big. It feels like there's a war going on around you. So, in Titanfall 2, where they go to campaign-wise, they went full Call of Duty style linear set-piece action bonanza on it. Under normal circumstances, this would be alright. The downside is that this is pretty restrictive, and it changes the way that you have to go about most of the encounters. So, on foot, levels are either obstacle courses or point-and-shoot galleries. And most of the time you can take advantage of the former to get past the latter. And the enemies do a lot of damage, especially if you're playing on Veteran. Veteran is not, well, the Veteran equivalent. I think it's called Legend or something in this game. But when you are playing on Legend specifically, but Hard isn't exactly afraid to beat the shit out of you as well. But on Veteran, the time to kill an enemy accuracy is so retarded, it makes Call of Duty Modern Warfare look like Hello Kitty's Island Adventure. The enemies will kill you so quickly if you so much as put your head out of your cover for half a second. If you get even remotely too close to them, they'll run up to you and melee you, and it's a one-hit kill no matter what you do. It feels like you have to rely on your cloak a ridiculous amount in order to survive for more than 2 seconds out of cover. And it means that you can't do what this game is really known for, which is wall running, unless you're actively trying to avoid combat. You see, most of the combat sections in this game, avoiding a couple of like ones where you have to be like, hey, you have to go around on foot and kill things for a while. It means that you have to, brain work with me here. It means that you basically have to wander around on foot, and it basically means you have to avoid as much combat as possible, whether it be throwing on your cloak as much as humanly possible, or just wall running outside of the field of vision of all of the enemies for as long as humanly possible. And that is the best way to do most combat in this game. Like, as I said before, the level where you're in the prefab factory and you have to work your way up, you're better off just hiding in the house. The level where you have to go backwards and forwards through time, just keep swapping. It's infinite. You don't have to worry about getting into combat with anyone. You just swap as much as you need to, and that's it. And there's a bunch of other levels that are like this too, like the one I talked about before, where it's a bunch of like structures up high over a cloud of poisonous fog. You just need to run across like a bunch of things. Use the cranes, because it seems like as soon as you get into the cranes, they can't actually shoot you for shit. And then just keep running for the most part. There's like 1 or 2 places where you really need to stop and shoot a couple of people, but that's it, really. So, yeah, most of the campaign just turns out to be really simple enemy avoidance, more or less. Compare this to at least Titanfall 1, where it was not only practice, but actual multiplayer games, where you actually stood a chance of winning or losing, and kept the levels dynamic. And I just can't help but wonder if they went in the wrong direction. Because it makes you think, well, when this is so disappointing, why didn't they just go to the effort of, remaking that style of campaign? And it doesn't help when the Titan shows up, because pretty much every time the Titan does show up, they force you to get into it. One of the best things about Titanfall 1 was equipping the advanced AI chip to your custom Titan, and just getting him to run in the streets below you, shooting at random enemies that come up, and using that as a warning to sneak up behind a dude and execute him. It was the absolute best thing you could do. It was badass, just having your Titan buddy support you, but there is almost no opportunities in this game to do that, because they'll either throw 2 or 3 Titans your way with next to no anti-Titan weaponry to take them out safely, or they'll make it so that the floor is poisonous so that you can't actually run around on foot. And that's pretty much the entirety of the Titan combat. It's going to be Titan on Titan no matter what you do. The enemies on foot are so small and zero damage, basically. You'll trample over 25 off them. They might take a segment or 2 off your health bar, but there'll be a battery waiting right there to fill you right back up. So it just becomes entirely linear and almost pointless to be in a Titan. It just starts feeling like a Call of Duty style linear hallway shooter, because that's basically what it turns into when you get into a Titan, in comparison to Titanfall 1, where you can look around in every direction, see enemies to shoot in every direction, and decide how you want to go about things. And of course, the absolute worst level that exacerbates this problem is the train level. Now, let me just bring this back into context for you. This is a game called Titanfall, where you're a pilot. You have the ability to run on walls, you have super cool future weaponry, and you have the ability to call in a Titan who can run around in the streets below you while you run on the walls and take out anything that might be threatening to him. And they set a level on a fucking train. I don't know who the fuck thought this was a good idea, but setting a level on a fucking train, which is the most linear thing imaginable. Hell, on most of the train level, they have you outside, so all you can do is walk straight forward, find cover and shoot things. Except when it comes to that one segment where you have to breach into like a command center on the train, where when you breach this particular... I'm just going to talk about this section in particular, because I played this on the master difficulty, and it pissed me off so much, because when you play this section on the master difficulty, as soon as you breach, 3 or 4 enemies will immediately turn towards you, despite there being like 11 of your AI buddies around you, and they will shoot you dead. You basically have to run away and take cover as soon as the game returns control to you, otherwise you're dead. And it's the most retarded thing ever. At least like in a Call of Duty style breach, right? They understand that it's a power fantasy for you to breach. So when you breach, it will slow down time, it'll let you shoot a few enemies, but on something like veteran difficulty, you might not actually be able to shoot them all pretty quick if you're relatively slow, so you might have to take cover from the last guy in particular, or you have to put in the effort to being really quick because they're like going to shoot a hostage or something, right? In this game, it's just breach, die, and that's basically it. So yeah, pretty much every level in this game falls under this pattern. It'll be a linear pilot section where the best thing you can do is wall run away or just lean on your cloak. That will be it for most of the combat encounters. For Titans, it's a linear point and shoot section where the only thing that really matters is other Titans. And there is nothing that really gives you that, you know, pilot in the air, Titan on the ground sort of thing going on, which is one of the best things you could do in the original Titanfall. Until I believe like right at the very end, where there's this like one linear section where you're running around, your AI is fighting him off for you, and you're just running around trying to protect him. But it's so linear it feels forced. Especially when you've had to avoid half the combat up to this point, because again, your time to kill is so low on something like Master. Again, if you're playing this, if you are considering picking up Titanfall 2 for the first time, I'd bloody hope not, considering how much I'm going to be ragging on it for the rest of this video. Considering how much that I've been ragging on, I'd recommend you play on hard and not master, because at least hard lets you do a couple of things that are cool, like running on the walls and shooting at enemies below you, right? With that said, though, let's talk about the pilot movement, because they nerfed it. They nerfed it into the fucking ground. Anyway, why Titanfall did it better? It was perfect. Like, I don't know how to say this without sounding like a retard or something like that, because it was legitimately perfect the way it was. Your movement physics, the speed you can get up to was fantastic. The running around on walls felt absolutely perfect. Shooting at people felt perfect, and pulling off ridiculous tricks like slingshotting around the map with nothing but your mouse and keyboard was one of the most satisfying things to do. And the maneuverability that you had made Titanfall feel like Titanfall. So I don't really know why they had to fuck it up. And don't get me wrong, you can still do some of those ridiculous tricks in Titanfall 2, but you often have to use something like the grapple, because here's the thing. They screwed with the physics in Titanfall 2, and they screwed with it hard. They made your character a lot heavier and a lot slower to probably make it feel more like one of those modern military shooters they were trying to pull the interest away from at the time. So, you know, screw people who enjoyed the floatiness and the lightweightness of the pilot physics. And it was legitimately so bad that the Titanfall subreddit was in an uproar when Titanfall 2 came out, the Titanfall 2 beta came out, because it was so sluggish that even I was thinking to myself, what the fuck happened? And so many people thought the same thing, that they released an update in the middle of the multiplayer beta to at least fix things a little. But man, if you didn't play that original multiplayer beta, you did not know how bad things were going to get. Because holy fuck, it was so bad. It was so bad. Just how slow and sluggish and heavy and just generally uninteresting you were. And they didn't even fix it completely. They only fixed it partially, because it still did not impress even after the game came out. And they even patched it a couple of times after launch. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I'm just thinking to myself, what the fuck did they have to do? What the fuck were they thinking to be like, hey, why on earth did you make this happen? Why on earth did you decide that the lightweight physics of Titanfall 1 was so bad that you had to replace it with something this heavy, slow, and obnoxious? The only thing that makes Titanfall 2's physics really tolerable to a Titanfall 1 player, and by player I mean someone who got up to at least Regen 4 like I did, was that, well, you just kind of had to use the grapple tactical, because it was the only thing that made actually moving around at speed without becoming a micromanaging asshole like some of the players in Titanfall 2 were. It was the only thing that made those games' physics tolerable, basically. And they also screwed it up with the combat, because Titanfall had pretty limited weaponry, I'll give you that. There was pretty much one weapon for every style of gameplay. Did you want to be a sniper? You were stuck with the Kraber. Did you want to be a runner and gunner? You were stuck with the SMG. Did you want to have a burst rifle or an automatic rifle? You had one for each, that was it. Excuse me. You had one for each, and that was it, right? So, it wasn't great, but it worked really well. Each one was tweaked so effectively that they all felt like they had their own ways to learn how to play. They all felt like you needed to use different tactics to use them effectively. And they were so few, there were so few of them, they were all just polished so well that they were all intensely satisfying to use, and you could easily find your own way of playing. You could easily find your own way of getting down and dirty without having to worry too much about any individual weaponry. And the best part about Titanfall 2 was that it broke the 2-weapon limit that we were all so familiar with modern military shooters. You got 3 weapons. You got your main weapon, your sidearm, and an anti-Titan weapon. So you could actually fight everything you could come across as soon as you came across it. So it made Titanfall 1 a little bit forgiving in the respect that you could choose what weapon you wanted for your anti-regular dude combat, your anti-Titan combat, and you didn't feel like you were compromised in trying to go in any particular way, right? Meanwhile, Titanfall 2. There weren't many additions to it, and they all felt like gimmicks. I will say that I did enjoy the, I enjoyed the Gravity Star and the Fire Star. They were actually pretty neat, like little additions to the arsenal, right? But there were a bunch of things that they took out which I really wasn't a fan of. A lot of noobs were complaining over the Smart Pistol, right? The Smart Pistol was the coolest idea ever, and frankly, if it got to the point where someone was able to lock onto you with 3 Smart Pistol headshots and then shoot you, they could have shot you with any other weapon anyway. And that was the case in like 99% of anti-pilot engagements. If they got a good shot on you with a Smart Pistol, you were dead already, basically, with any other weapon. But of course, people, and I say people, but I really mean people who really needed to get good, people complained about that and they got rid of the Smart Pistol entirely. But that's not the only problem. The biggest one, and this one was so egregious that they patched it out less than a month after launch, was that they only had 2 weapon slots. They went back to 2 weapon slots, so you could only have an anti-Titan weapon or a sidearm. You couldn't have a both. So you would eventually become strangled when you were trying to face one or the other, right? If you took an anti-Titan weapon, eventually you'd get to the point where you had to fight off like more than one pilot at once, and you'd be out of ammo, and the second pilot who found you would just be able to kill you, instead of you being able to like swap to your sidearm and have a chance of fighting them off. Or you could take the sidearm, but as soon as the pilots started coming down in Titans, you were done, basically. You had to either swap gear set or try and avoid Titans as much as possible, and considering that Titans were worth the most amount of points in Attrition, which was the main mode in Titanfall, and well, they tried to make a different main mode in this one, but we'll get to that. Trust me, we'll get to that. But yes, the fact that they tried to make it so that you had to choose... Also, sidearms were great for taking out grunts as well. You could just swap to the sidearm, shoot a few grunts, reload, and then go back to your main weapon, or something like that, right? But yeah, this was legitimately so obvious that they patched in a third weapon slot after the game came out for the multiplayer. They didn't do it for the single player, because the game was obviously designed around you only having 2 weapons. But... considering that they felt the need to patch that in so close after launch, it's obvious how big of a mistake it was. So, there's the 2 big mistakes they made right off the bat, right? 2 weapon slots and nerfed pilot physics. So, what do you think they were... like, what do you think was the main plan behind Titanfall 2 if it wasn't fucking up everything Titanfall 1 did? But anyway, there is also another set of new weapons they actually introduced alongside Titanfall 2, right? And the main one was Grenadiers. And Grenadiers were terrible. So to give you what I think Grenadiers were meant to do, I'm not entirely sure what they were meant to do personally. I don't know where they sat on the game design document, right? But in Titanfall 2, Grenadiers felt like they were meant to be a replacement for the fact that you couldn't do, they felt like they were meant to be a replacement for the fact that you only had 2 weapon slots. So you could take a Grenadier along and it would be equally as effective at taking on grunts, specters, and pilots alongside Titans, right? But they were so fucking awful at doing that I never saw them online. Like, I legitimately played up to Generation 2, and I'd be lying if I said I saw Grenadiers more than a handful of times, because they were just that useless. They also introduced a bunch of new weapons that just weren't very good at all. For those of you who hate the Mozambique, don't worry. Everybody who played Titanfall 2 hated it as well. And we were always using the RE45 Auto or the Wingman, because the Mozambique was just so unreliable, even in Titanfall 2, that everyone hated it. So yeah, it was something else entirely. There was also things like the Mastiff, which was just a line shotgun, which nobody liked either. And trust me, nobody likes it in Apex either. I mean, somebody probably does, considering how many people play fucking Apex and not fucking Titanfall 1. I'm still pissed about that, by the way. But yeah, it was just... It was horrifically awful to limit us to 2 weapons. And the Grenadier was just the slicing on the cake, right? Because you think to yourself, this is what they introduced to, like, try and make having 2 weapons not hurt as much. But it just hurt even more, because they were so terrible. But yes... it was bad. It was really bad. So, pilot on Titan combat. We talked about it before, but in the sense that, you know, you had a choice in Titanfall 2 to begin with, which was either you were really good against Titans or you were really good against pilots and grunts. You couldn't pick both. So, why did Titanfall 2 did pilot on Titan gameplay better? Because the best thing about being a pilot was the fact that you were able to actively take on a Titan and win. So, Titans in Titanfall 1 were actually dangerous, don't get me wrong. They could absolutely wipe you out in one shot. But there were certain things about being a Titan that you had to be wary of. Not every single Titan in the entire fucking game got a go-away cloud. So, you had to approach a Titan in a myriad of different ways to be prepared for anything, because the Titan could have a go-away cloud, but it also couldn't. So you could choose, you could absolutely think to yourself, oh, this guy isn't worth going for, he might have a cloud, or this guy's worth going for, but I'm going to need some way to get away post-haste, because that electric cloud will kill me if I stand around in it for too long, right? So you could actively kill a Titan. You could constantly fire, like, archer rockets into it, or you could mount the Titan, and you could be consistently shooting the pilot, the pilot's Titan just in the weak spot, right? So the Titan would have to get off the Titan, and it would have to face you. It would have to get out of the Titan, and he would have to face you. Not to mention, if the Titan actually had that enhanced AI chip, it could turn around and shoot you in the face as well. So, again, it's just balancing your risks and your rewards. Not to mention that while you're mounted on the back of the enemy Titan, any enemy pilot or Titan could come along and shoot you off in the process. So, you can decide whether or not it was worth the risk to stay on the back of the Titan and finish him off, or just do a little bit of damage, get off, and then let another Titan or another pilot come along and finish the job for you, right? So, on both sides of the combat, there was risk. So, it made things a lot more interesting, just in general, right? And while there were a lower amount of anti-Titan weapons, they were all equally as effective once you were skilled enough. There was the grenade launcher, which was a little bit more effective against humans than it was Titans, but it was still relatively good because you could actually, like, say, launch grenades over a building and stay out of the way, which was a really nice touch, right? You had the archer rocket, which would lock on and do a massive amount of damage, and you had the charge rifle, which you had to maintain line of sight for, but it still worked pretty well in the grand scheme of things. It was a good in-between, right? Titanfall 2 was a lot worse than this, because every single Titan got that go-away cloud. So it made Titan combat, when you're a pilot, a lot more linear, because all you were able to do was, if you were trying to get in close, right, was get in close, wait for them to pop their cloud, and then run the fuck away. You can only take a small portion of their health to boot, because when you hop onto the back of a Titan in Titanfall 2, you can only take a small amount of their health away as a battery. And it's incredibly easy once you're forced off the back of a Titan for the enemy Titan to just turn around and shoot you dead, right? Unless you're literally like right in the middle of a bunch of buildings or something that you can just run away into, the enemy Titan will be alerted that you're there, that your health has been stolen, and that he'll just turn around and shoot you. He can do that if he likes. It's just nowhere near as fun, because you can't force him out of his Titan. You can't make it so that he's got less ways to take you on. And, yeah, the fact that you have to go and find a friendly Titan in order to not make use of the battery that you've just been given means that most of the pilot on Titan combat was just nerfed down to you might as well just shoot him for a long distance. And the anti-Titan weapons were unbalanced. And I don't know if they still are. They might have patched it like months after the game came out, but yeah, the best anti-Titan weapon in the game, bar none, was the Archer, the anti-Titan rocket, which was the lock-on rocket. You just used that all the time, because it did the most damage by far, and the charge rifle, even when you upgraded it so that it could shoot faster, was still slower in the long run. So you just wouldn't bother. You just use the Archer rocket all the time. So they fucked up pilot on Titan combat in every particular way. It's literally easier just to stand back and fire rockets at it all the time, because going in to get the battery is just a linear, boring process. He can turn around to shoot you just almost immediately, which actually happened a fair amount. Not all the time, but enough to not make it worth the hassle. And the fact that you just have to run away and go to another Titan and just give him the battery and then go back to what you were doing meant that it was just... It just meant that either you were a bandit, you just ran along, grabbed the battery, you ran away, or you ran in, you started shooting from long distance, and that was it. It meant that you had no real recourse for getting up close and personal, and it made playing as a pilot facing Titans so boring as a result. Because there were only a couple of things you could do in comparison to Titanfall 1, where it was like, you could shoot it from long range, you could just go in and try and like harass him with something like the grenade launcher to keep him distracted. You could get on his back and just do a little bit of damage or do a lot of damage. There were options, which they just removed, because fuck you, I guess. Fuck gameplay diversity. Speaking of fuck gameplay diversity, fuck Titans, because in Titanfall 1, you could customize your Titan down to its individual abilities, down to its individual weaponry, and down to its stature. So you could have a Titan that was thin and fast, or fat and bulky and slow. And considering that you could pick any like set of Titan weapons that you wanted, it meant that you had options. Again, options. So while, you could do something along the lines of a tanky Titan Tormentor, where you would fire, where you just constantly shoot at other Titans and not worry about grunts, or you can make yourself a glass cannon, but you will grunt killing machine. You'd just be running around, you'd be looking down at the enemy grunt or specters and shooting them for those bonus points in attrition, and then just running away whenever you saw another Titan. Or you could do a combination of both, or you could come up with some other weird thing you could do. And the fact that you were customizable down to this point meant that you actually had some, again, it feeds back into the Pilot on Titan combat, where you weren't entirely sure what the enemy Titan had until you got on top of them and found out for yourself, which made Titan versus Titan and Pilot versus Titan combat interesting, because you never knew what you were going up against until you were actually in the fight and you had to work around it. And every Titan in Titanfall 1 is, well, I'm not going to say it's immensely balanced. Like, someone who's using, like, the 10mm cannon is going to have an advantage over the light and simple Titan all the time, right? But it meant that everyone at least had a chance of taking down every other enemy Titan, right? And the little animation that you got when you got into the Titan, so that, you know, you'd hop in first person, the thing would come down around you, the screen would boot up in front of you. It had class and it had character, and I loved seeing that animation every time because it just gave that game that little bit more charm. Titanfall 2 changed it so that you only had a set of Titan classes, so they're okay at first. They do give the game a little bit more variety, but the problem is that they become predictable. As soon as you see what a Titan's class is, you know exactly what it's capable of, you know exactly what it's likely to do, and depending on the Titan that you're in at the time, you know how generally capable you're going to be at taking on that particular Titan class. So as soon as you come up against a Titan that you're bad against, you might as well either run away or eject. It's not like Titanfall 1 where if you see like a tank as a lightweight guy, you think to yourself, okay, I stand a chance here, I just need to be careful about how I approach this. In Titanfall 2, it's basically, oh fuck, I have to deal with this thing again. Run away! And that's basically all that you have to do, right? That's basically all your options against a bad Titan. Run away or die. And leveling up individual Titans in order to unlock their special kit is not fun. You have to level them up individually in order to unlock things like the AI improvement kit or special variations on their weapons. And it's so slow and repetitive, especially if you're like one who tries to frequently swap Titan classes to keep ahead of what the enemy's bringing in. It just makes it that much slower and uninteresting. And not to mention, they removed the animation of the first person getting into the Titan. For the entire game is in first person until you get into a Titan, at which point it swaps to a third person view. And then it just swaps back to the first person view once you got it in. And I don't know why. It was so cool, jumping towards the back of your Titan, being grabbed by him, and then being shoved into the chest cavity while in first person. I don't know why they removed it. It just seems they didn't understand what made Titanfall so cool in the first place. That just seems to be the entirety of the reason why they removed that. They didn't understand what was so cool about it. Moving on. Progression. It borrowed the progression system from Call of Duty. Titanfall 1. It borrowed the progression system from Call of Duty because it was by Respawn, the people who made Call of Duty's like unlock system in Call of Duty 4, so as cool as it was in the first place, right? And while it was like, you know, it was just a spin-off of that system, there were so many challenges that you always felt like you were getting rewarded for something, whether it be taking out grunts, using specific weapons, performing certain objectives, and even really out there ones. Like my personal favorite was the one where you had to shoot pilots that were ejecting from Titans once their Titans self-destructed, right? It was the absolute best. Like, I'm not even kidding. A lot of people complained about that challenge in particular, and I can kind of understand. Like, they made you do it something like 25 times, which was ridiculous. 5 was more than enough. And that's what they eventually patched it down to in Titanfall 1, right? But it was so cool to have to do that. And there were a bunch of challenges that they would make you do, right? There were a bunch of challenges they would make you do every time you needed to prestige. So it meant that you were building your skills in even the most uncommon ways. And I found that to be an absolutely fantastic little design. And there were so many challenges that you were getting XP boosts and burn cards constantly. They were constantly giving them to you, which meant that at least you felt like you got some sort of reward, even if it was something that you only needed to, even if it was something you only got to use once, it was still really enjoyable. Titanfall 2 fucked it up. They introduced this new system called credits, which you earn at the pace of a snail on a turtle. No fancy challenges to speed your progress up anymore, so no, like, shooting pilots out of the air in order to get, like, fancy prestige challenges or anything like that. You have to be constantly swapping weapons, because weapons level up individually, and the rate that they level up is a lot slower once they get to the higher levels. So if you want to be consistently leveling up fast, you have to be swapping between weapons as much as humanly possible, which is just thoroughly annoying if you want to get used to one particular weapon set. And considering that you earn 2 credits for a loss and 3 credits for a win, it makes leveling up really slow if you have the bad luck of being stuck with a bunch of shitty people. Now, I'm not amazing, but I tend to do as well as my team does. So if my team is really bad, I'm going to suffer along with them, and that's not satisfying in the slightest. To have that much of your leveling potential come down to whether or not you win or lose is ridiculous, because it makes it feel like it's on a roll of the dice more than anything else. And the resource that you unlock for leveling up, which is credits, they can be used to buy things early, so that you don't have to go through the leveling progression once you prestige. But the costs are so high that it'll take you something like half a prestige in order to unlock one thing, whether it be like a piece of equipment or a gun or an ability or something like that, and it's just not worth the cost. Because you don't know until you're already so far into it that it feels like the credits have basically no point in being there in the first place. It's just infinitely less satisfying on a base level. Speaking of infinitely less satisfying on a base level, let's talk about burn cards. I loved burn cards. I thought burn cards were the absolute best idea that a first-person shooter has come up with in years. So here's how they worked. They were disposable boosts for that life and that life alone. Whether it be a weapon with an upgraded stat, infinite kinds of a certain accessory, the ability to like run on walls for longer and for further, things like that, right? It was so cool. Even the free titans that you would get from time to time weren't particularly overpowered. Somehow, I don't know how they managed to make that work. Like, I was on a team, right, where we managed to call in like 3 titans at the very beginning of the game. We're talking like 5 seconds in, everyone burnt a burn card, and we still lost. 3 titans should have been a massive advantage to the amount of people who were complaining the burn cards were overpowered, but somehow they weren't. I don't understand how they managed to make that entire system work, but it was so well done that it was immensely satisfying. You would constantly get them via the challenges too. Like, so you'd have like a full deck of burn cards that you could constantly slot in to your slots during multiplayer matches. And you could burn them as much as you wanted, and you'd always have a set of them coming in, right? So you wouldn't have to worry about like using the rare burn cards. No, you could just use them as much as you wanted. It will let you fuck around as much as you so desired. It was limited by the fact that you could only use 3 per game, but still, you could just be constantly trying out weird strategies and just having fun with ridiculous weaponry, because they would actually give you like burn cards for things like weapons that you didn't have yet. So you could actually try out that weapon at least for 1 life, so you knew whether or not, once you got your hands on it, whether or not you would actually want to use it, which was actually a really cool idea. Like, I don't have any downsides about this system whatsoever. They let you, even like later on in the game's life cycle, they would let you recycle burn cards to get new ones and stuff like that, and there was no microtransactions involved. At least as far as I remember anyway. I didn't really need them, but yeah, the system was so cool, and I'm immensely disappointed that they didn't carry this on to Titanfall 2, because Titanfall 2's replacement for burn cards were just glorified skill streaks, and they were absolutely horrific. Like, some of them were useless. There was a hard cover shield which nobody took, because it was just a shield you could plop down and never move again. Why would you take that over literally anything else? The anti-Titan turret that you got was actually alright, but it was too easy to destroy. And one of my favourites, of course, the smart pistol, was moved to a boost. But the thing is, they didn't actually make it that much more powerful to really qualify it as a boost, so there was no point to it. You wouldn't take that one either, because it was just too weak to justify taking along in place of anything else. As a result, it just feels boring. just like the rest of Titanfall 2. But yeah, it could have been a decent burn card system with a point limit on when you could use cards to fend off button balance, but no, it was just, nah, it just sucked. It just sucked. That was the main problem with it. It just sucked. Speaking of which, we're onto the multiplayer at this point, aren't we? And that would be the game modes. So, Attrition was the main mode, but that warrants its own section with how badly they fucked that one up. Yeah. In Titanfall, Attrition was the main mode. It was treated like it felt like it, and it fit the overall design of Titanfall's gameplay, right? But they had modes like Capture the Flag and Hardpoint Domination, which were well designed for the maps that they were on, and they still felt entirely appropriate for the setting. And there was some other modes that were introduced later on, which didn't go against the entirety of the gameplay structure, like Marked for Death. I loved Marked for Death. I was hoping that they were going to turn that into a mainline mode in Titanfall 2, because Marked for Death was so well done that it felt like a mode that they shipped along with the base game. If you don't know what Marked for Death is, it's what it sounds like. One player is marked as the one that needs to run the fuck away, and everyone else needs to shoot them in order to get points, and then start earning points for themselves when they get marked. It was brilliant. Every single game felt like a mad rush to get the dude. It was, seriously, Titanfall 1 at its peak was something that I still remember to this day. Why was Titanfall 2 worse? Attrition was nerfed into the ground. But again, that's worth its own section. They tried to replace it with this new mode called Bounty Hunt, which was just this absolutely horrific slog. Nobody liked it. So if you don't know what Bounty Hunt was, if you haven't played Titanfall 2, Bounty Hunt was you needing to kill enemies, grunts, and what have you in the same style as Attrition in order to earn money. And then you go check that money in at specific points in order to add score for your team. The problem was that earning this money was slow, and at any point, if you died, you would lose the absolute majority of what you just earned, making the entire game feel like a Battle Royale game or a DayZ game, for example, where you get that frustration of losing everything that you just worked for, but none of the satisfaction of having, like, putting in the effort to build it up in the first place. Wasn't helped by the fact that people would regularly camp all of the, like, money earning points on the map. So it was basically just, you would never be able to find one that wasn't free of, like, one fuck-off camper with a gigantic sniper who would just shoot you as soon as you came into view of the thing. And it was disliked so badly that they introduced Amped Hardpoint as the new main mode, as, like, the successor to the original game's Hardpoint Domination mode. But they fucked with that too, because what they did was they made it so that all of the points could be amped, which was worth double the score. And by amp, it was basically just you stick around for longer, which absolutely killed the pacing of the game, because instead of waiting around for 5 seconds to earn the point and then go off to do something else, you had to wait around for 15 seconds, because otherwise you wouldn't get the maximum amount of points out of it. And it just slowed the pace to a crawl considerably, because everybody was just waiting around, waiting for these fucking hard points to be taken. And it was just, again, it was no fun. Like, what the fuck were they thinking? Like, all of these seem determined to reduce the pace of Titanfall, to make it so that it wasn't anywhere near as quick and enjoyable. But they missed the point of Titanfall in the first place, which was to be quick and enjoyable. What the fuck were they thinking? And the special modes that were, like, that should have been main modes. Like, as I said, Marked for Death. That should have been a main mode. But again, it was left by the wayside because they decided to introduce these new sets of modes that were entirely based on, what's the word I'm looking for? They tried to introduce these new sets of modes that were entirely based on pilots versus pilots. And again, Titanfall, where you run around in the streets where you run around on the sides of buildings as a dude, while a Titan runs on the streets below you in order to back you up. Why the fuck are they only focusing on one half of this formula? It doesn't make any fucking sense. Anyway. But yeah, the modes that didn't really need to exist. There were live fire, which was basically just like, you know, Counter-Strike rules. You got 5 on one team, 5 on the other team, they die, and the first team to get wiped out loses. You got Coliseum, which was 1-on-1 and required special tickets that you needed. And again, pilot only. and pilots versus pilots, where you, pilots versus pilots, where you had to just, you know, it was just basically just 6 on 6 for however long, and the team that got the most kills at the end wins. There was this one mode that sort of kind of got upgraded to a main mode, which was, basically everybody started out in Titans, and the first team to run out of Titans would lose. But once you got ejected from your Titan, you still got to run around as a pilot and deal extra damage, which was, you know, useful. That kind of got upgraded into a main mode, but everything else should have just been thrown out the window. Bounty Hunt, fuck it, get rid of it entirely. Amped Hardpoint, just bring it back to Hardpoint. There was no need to amp it up. It was fine the way it was. We'll get onto Attrition, of course. And, yeah, just all of the pilots versus pilots modes, again, throw them out. What's the fucking point? It's called Titanfall, for fuck's sake. You're getting rid of the fucking Titans. Map design and scale. I already talked about this earlier, but let's go over it again. Titanfall made you feel like a big fish in a humongous pond. The maps were massive. They felt true to scale. All the grunts and the pilots would feel tiny in comparison to everything else. It felt like a giant battlefield. There were tons of paths between multiple central areas. It was nothing like Call of Duty's 3-lane design at all. And you had plenty of room to find your way out of tough situations, because you had all these tons of tiny little areas that you could run through to run away from enemy Titans, but that also wouldn't stop enemy Titans from poking their head in, seeing a pilot being careless, and shooting them dead without a second thought, right? It was wonderful. It was a wonderful set of maps, and even like the DLC maps that they made fit the standard perfectly, right? It felt like war. That was the coolest thing about it. It felt like war. Titanfall 2 was worse in ways that I can't even describe, and we'll get onto it. So, blatant 3-lane design across most maps, with most of the paths being connectors between them. So, every map started feeling the same as soon as the game launched. And compared to how well they did the design for Titanfall 1, it was like, what the fuck happened? Did they just fire most of their multiplayer designers? The main thing that is incredibly wrong with the entirety of the Titanfall 2 maps is their scale. And it feels so weird if you had played Titanfall 1 before, but then went to Titanfall 2, because all the maps felt off in scale. You felt like a midget, and all of the maps felt like a dollhouse, right? Because they were so much smaller, and they had like these weird scale problems where buildings were a bit bigger than they were supposed to be, but Titans were about the same, and it just didn't feel right at all. Everything felt so much weirder as a result, right? It's so weird. Like, I know it's hard to describe, but when you play Titanfall 1 and you've got this big fish in a huge pond style thing going on, and then you drop into Titanfall 2, which made everyone feel way bigger than they should. I've got the analogy for it. It's like shoving like big action figures into small doll houses, basically. That was what that felt like. And it wasn't right. It wasn't right at all. And it just made me feel weird the entire time I played the game, right? Most of them are unmemorable as well. I'd be lying if I could say I could remember any of like the major points of any of the Titanfall 2 maps. So, yeah, not great. And you know what the thing is? They realized this as well, to the point where they started porting maps from the original Titanfall. But they suffered the same scale problems, so Angel City in Titanfall 2 feels nothing like Angel City in Titanfall 1, and it suffers from the same design problems. So all the maps feel the same. The scale is so weird that it doesn't feel like the war anymore, and it feels like dolls playing around in a dollhouse that's slightly too small for them. And it just gets boring. It just gets so incredibly boring after a while, because all the maps are the fucking same. They all have the same design. They all have the same 3-lane bullshit going on, and it's nowhere near as fun. Speaking of which, let's talk about Attrition, because Attrition is the biggest disappointment of the entire series at this point, up in a nutshell. So, Titanfall 1 had Attrition mode, which was the best mode in the entire series. It was Team Deathmatch with a twist. You had AI companions and enemies running around. They would run around and shoot each other, but you could also go around and run and shoot them. And you can even go and hack enemy AI Spectres, which were their AI drones, if you wanted to risk your neck. The pacing was absolutely perfect. The AI would run around tactically. You could easily see them running around, like, taking positions and trying to survive, dropping into areas, and you could go and help them out, or you could go comp stomp. Like, Attrition was the one team deathmatch mode in a game where you could comp stomp and legitimately win the game for your entire team. While everyone else is busy dealing with your pilots, I was off usually dealing with, like, the enemy grunts. I'd have, like, half the score on the entire team, and we'd win by, like, 10 points or something like that. More often than not. I had a lot of fun comp stomping. As a result, Attrition feels like the most at war atmosphere of a game mode that I've ever played. Because when you play Titanfall 1 and you get into that sense of, like, being on this gigantic battlefield with a ton of dudes backing you up, there's nothing like it in any other first-person shooter. But, again, in Titanfall 2, they screwed with it in so many ways that they thought to themselves, we really shouldn't make this the main mode, otherwise we're probably going to get a lot of pissed off comments. And they were right, because the AI was nerfed into the ground in Titanfall 2's Attrition mode. They're so dumb. They just stand there. Like, it wasn't like Titanfall 1 had the best enemy AI to begin with, but at the same time, there's this level where you had to think to yourself, okay, they have to be a certain amount of stupid so that I can get my power fantasy by running around and killing an entire squad of them without so much as, you know, taking a hit. But at the same time, the grunt AI could hurt you. It could hurt you bad if you let up for even a second, right? One could very easily turn around and shoot you to death. I can't count the amount of times where I managed to escape by the skin of my teeth in Titanfall 1 from an enemy pilot, only to run into an enemy grunt who would turn around and blast me with a shotgun and kill me. They could do that relatively consistently if you weren't careful, so they weren't stupid. In Titanfall 2, they were stupid. They were really stupid. They didn't move anywhere near as much, they didn't shoot anywhere near as much. They were literally just targets for you to kill, and there were so few of them that you completely lost that at-war atmosphere. It just felt like a couple of dudes had gotten lost on their way to the buffet or something. Spectres, while they were more meant to be, just like foot soldier replacements, they turned into just these really big tanks that still got you the same amount of points as grunts did, so basically they weren't even worth the effort to kill. Sure, you could try to hack them, but again, the AI has gotten so dumb between Titanfall 1 and Titanfall 2 that they don't even bother trying to kill enemy grunts anymore. And again, there's so few of them in comparison to Titanfall 1 that chances are they're just going to run to an enemy pilot who's just going to go to the effort of shooting them dead anyway, so what's the fucking point? And the thing about Titanfall 1 was that enemy troops and Spectres would get dropped in pretty regularly, right? But it would maintain a decent pace by not dropping in massive tank units that would take so much effort to kill that it feels like everybody would need to stop and shoot at these massive tank units for a while in order to make sure that the pace of the game kept up and nobody was running around getting shot in the back by these gigantic tank units. Titanfall 2 would drop these tank units in on you all the time, and it meant that you had to stop and shoot them all the time, because if you didn't, it would just stick there and just constantly shoot at you and be a really annoying pain in the ass. They were worth points, don't get me wrong, but not enough for the effort you had to put in to kill them. So, yeah. Attrition just got nerfed so hard on the ground with the scale problems, the lack of AI running around, the dumbness of the AI running around, everything else that went wrong with the game, like the pilot versus Titan combat, the Titan versus pilot combat, the Titan versus Titan combat, and everything else, that it feels like an absolute shadow of what made Titanfall 1 feel great in the first place. And it's just immensely boring as a result. And that's the list of complaints that I've got. I've already talked about a couple of things that, that were decent about Titanfall 2. And there's a couple that I would, I'd say that are decent improvements. You don't have to be always online to play the campaign. Sure. Why not? Free DLC maps, although considering how things are supposed to be going these days, it's like commending a cat for not pooping on the rug. And the relationship between BT and the player in the campaign, it's generic in its writing, but it's enjoyable. It's humorous, it's funny, it's a little bit touching, but nothing to write home about at the end of the day, right? But that's basically all the pluses I've got to say about Titanfall 2. I mean, sure, it looks better, but, you know, that's just kind of what you expect after, in a sequel that's like 2 years after the original. And I've got nothing but negatives outside of them. It's so boring. It fucks up the Titanfall formula in so many ways. And next thing you know, Titanfall 2 got released like the same day as like 2 other major FPSs. I can't remember what they were at the time. I think it was like Battlefield 1 and the Call of Duty game, but I could be wrong about that. But yeah, it was basically released like dead center in the middle of big FPS season. So the initial sales basically just went straight into the ground, right? And they thought to themselves, okay, you couldn't stand up against literally our biggest Titan and their biggest Titan, so you're not worth anything. We're not going to give you any money to make Titanfall 3. And the story behind Apex Legends is that Respawn went to EA and they were like, we want to do whatever it is we want to do with Apex Legends, right? And they were like, sure, we'll let you do whatever you want to do with Apex Legends. And then they came out with a Battle Royale that was so bog standard, outside of its theme being in the Titanfall universe, that I just can't help but think to myself that they were lying. Whether it be Respawn that was lying about saying, hey, we want to do whatever we want, whether it be EA lying saying, hey, go do what you want, someone is lying through their teeth. Because there is no fucking way the Battle Royale, the biggest thing on the planet in video games at that time, and still arguably one of the biggest things in video games to this day, there is no way that EA would have been like, oh, we're going to let you do whatever you want if it was anything other than Battle Royale at the time, right? There was no way that Respawn Entertainment weren't going to be allowed to do whatever the fuck they wanted. And it's just such egregious bullshit that I can't help but think that EA were basically at Respawn's throats, saying to them, make use of this Titanfall IP to make us some money, or we're going to have a problem. Because Apex Legends is even worse than Titanfall. It's Titanfall without the wall running. It's Titanfall without everything that makes Titanfall Titanfall. It's just a bright, colourful first-person shooter with a couple of unique characters and Battle Royale gameplay. And I've tried it more than a few times, and I'm always deathly bored every time. What the fuck happened? Seriously, what the fuck happened? Titanfall is dead. You know what? Considering how big of a downturn Titanfall 2 was compared to Titanfall 1, considering that they just seem completely incapable of understanding what made Titanfall 1 so special, considering that they just seemed to not even understand what made Titanfall 2 like even remotely enjoyable to the wider populace, to the point where half of that shit got removed for Apex Legends, let it stay dead. It should have died. It should have died along with Titanfall 2. Apex Legends shouldn't have even been a Titanfall spin-off. They should have just made it its own thing. And to be fair, they practically did. May Titanfall rest in peace, but if they do decide to make a Titanfall 3, just make Titanfall 1 again. Just throw out everything that was Titanfall 2. Please. I don't want to deal with this anymore. I don't want this empty space in my heart where Titanfall is supposed to be anymore. Just let it die. This has been Blue Maxima, and I will see you all next time.